Hey everybody, this is Tom, and this week's character is Remington Loonsoul for Gianni. This was another theme week. It was Drow week. Drow are dark-skinned elves that live underground. They worship a giant spider called Lolth. They're a weird matriarchal society where the women elves enslave and beat the crap out of the male elves, and probably the most notable one that anybody's ever heard of is Driz de Werden. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. He's this awesome swashbuckling elf with some sweet swords and a giant cat that he hangs out with and goes on adventures. And that's the one that I've always been most familiar with. And just his stories are I'd recommend reading them if you like fantasy books. But yeah, in this case, it was for the most part business as usual, just elven style as far as everything goes, except for he just has black skin instead of the typical skin tone that we see on most elves. So, in the case of this character, he was actually the smallest write-up yet as far as information on the character, but there's definitely enough to get me started and to bring something to completion. But it took a lot of just simplicity and interpretation, and I can go into that as we go. But starting off with the pose that he's got, it's based mostly around the weapon that he has, which is a rapier, and it's like one of those fancy like sword dueling swords with the big like handguard and everything. And I think when coming up with poses for all these characters, considering their weapon is a good thing, especially if they're actually going to be using it. And so something like a rapier, they have a really distinct kind of motion set, or like a look to the way that people move when they're using them. It's just a very they've got really flexible wrists and fancy kind of almost dancey sort of poses, and there's a lot of motion and movement when the people are fighting with their rapier. And so I thought, I'd try to go for something a little bit more lean back and off balance, but motiony, or it was some movement. So that's what I was going for with this one. As far as personality, there wasn't much outlined in the write-up, so I figured without knowing him too much, I wouldn't make so many assumptions, and I would just I think using the weapon for the basis is a pretty good start. And this is something that would be good too in gaming. If you're doing concept art for games, and you don't want to just do all of your character concept art in T-pose. That's more for once you're further down the line and you're doing costume variations. And it varies for company to company, project to project, and what have you. But when you're trying to capture the look of the character, it's good to find them in a pose that you're going to see them as in game, likely, or something that just even aside from expressing that character. And so in a game, you're going to be running around using your weapon, and the combat is one of the most important parts of any sort of game that has characters in it. So thinking of that and how they're going to be maybe moving with their weapon, or how they're going to use it, that can be a really good place to start with character design. It's even good because it gets you closer to the end result. And so if you know kind of what sort of postures and motions your character is going to be in for most of the time, even that can change the way that you're going to design it more from a graphic design element. If you're going to need to, if it's something that just looks like a lumpy ball from a certain angle, or you need something with some more surface detail or whatever, that can all change just from how your character is going to be viewed by their animation or by the camera or whatever it's going to be going on. But it's like you'd want to draw them posing with their weapon for the same reason you'd want to design them standing up rather than sitting down, because that's how you're going to be seeing them most of the time. So even now, looking back at this, I even think now I did the pelvis too large. I could easily tone that down a little bit. It's still within a human range, but yeah, it's sort of one of the things about art that always sneaks up is just after even just a little bit of time has passed, you'll always notice and look back and notice things when you're looking back and just see stuff that you would have liked to have done differently or tweaked or fixed. And the severity of that varies, of course, but I think it is a good sign. It's a better sign than a bad sign if you look back at stuff that you've done and think you could do better. That's a good sign. Even though it's a little bit soul crushing, but as long as you're making progress, and it's all worth it. So he's described as being fairly strapping. He's very light for his height. So I was trying to find some sort of balance for like how I didn't want to make him bulky, so I just made him very like highly defined muscles, like low body fat, just to make it for the weight. He's 5'10" and 160 pounds, and that's really lanky, especially if he's also strapping and muscular. So there's really going to be there can't be that much fat on the body with those sorts of numbers. Yeah, I wanted to have a twisting body. There's a lot of that sort of stuff with fencing or rapier fighting. I think fencing is done with the those other types of swords. I can't remember the name of them right now. But yeah, lots of figuring out. It's always like this. I actually felt like it's been there's some time since I had done one of these, and I don't know what it was in my brain, but I just felt like I had forgotten everything as I was going. So this part took a bit longer for me this time around. It felt like I just haven't had much time to be drawing lately. I've just been so busy, and there's just no time anymore for anything, it seems. But this one I was sort of out of it. Even though I've been doing some sketching here and there, it's just there's so much to remember when it comes to the body. I think I'm going to even start doing videos where I try to just jump straight to the pose and see what happens from there. I might reverse engineer a few like some of the features and limbs and things just to make sure it's all working, but I think it might be a nice way to break things up and sort of work, I guess, backwards from this point. Try out different techniques. That's one thing I want to be doing in more of in these videos, is trying out different approaches and methods. Even though this one's fun, it's even just for not just for my benefit, but for anybody who's watching and learning, it might be good to see different types of drawing, because everybody eventually figures out their own way that they like going about it. And as long as you're winding up with the results you want, then it doesn't matter how you go about drawing it. As long as you can do it if you can end up with a quality piece in a goodly amount of time, then you can just do it however you want. You can get there however you want to get there. In the case of Remington, because he is very lean, I didn't bother with a skin stage, because for the most part his muscles are going to be visible, especially the muscles that I focus on drawing. It's very rare that I depict things like a secondary level muscle. It's all just like the visible stuff from the surface for the most part. I mean, that's going to be the primary focus of all your anatomy endeavors. But there are a few things, I mean, the more you can know, the better in every situation. But there are some muscles here and there that it makes other things make sense if you know that they're there. Like even like the shape of the pecs. There's a little, I don't remember what it's called, but there's a little thing that attaches to this weird little hook on the on your shoulder blade, and it comes down over you to the front of your chest, and even that sort of lifts up the top outer corner of your pectoral muscle, and that helps give it some of its shape. And there's a lot of stuff like that, but if you just focus on drawing like athletes and diagrams, you'll get pretty far. I like life drawing. I mean, really, as long as you can get the outward appearance, that should work well. So I'm going to go over his backstory. Shouldn't take long. So you guys know what the heck I'm doing here. So the character is Remington Loonsoul. So he's 23 years old, a male, strapping young man. His father was a messenger of Paylor, which is granted Remington some traits befitting this, such as his left eye, which is hazel, and his other eye is the normal Drow indigo. His white hair is kept long, but has a small ponytail, like Geralt from Witcher 3. He stands about 5'10", weighing 160 pounds. He's a slim fellow, with muscles enough to spare for fighting the enemies of the Moon Temple he has sworn to. His armor is splint, with the white robes of the clergy above it, allowing for some coverage but still protecting him. I've always seen him as an Edward Kenway's base armor from Assassin's Creed 4. He wields a rapier with gold inlay in his left hand, decorated with a sun-like flourish at the base of the rapier. He also carries a small heater in his right hand, with a crescent moon of black as the sigil. Sorry for the wall of the text, yada yada yada, if you need anything, let me know. So that's it. That's a pretty quick write-up. So things like his hairstyle, his eye color, his physique, his age, his costume, it's all in there. One thing that was nice about this was I don't think I've drawn anybody yet with a heater shield. That's like basically like kind of the kite shaped shield with like the flat top, or a rounded top even, and splint armor, which is actually quite fascinating. Japan and Europe both had it. It's basically by splint they just mean like if you get your arm in a splint and there's the out in the wilderness and you got those little sticks of wood to help keep it straight. Those are splints. And so splint armor is these long bands of metal or like lacquered material that would be used just sort of like it would be it's basically like spaced out armor. So it's lighter, it's not as hot. It's more for like glancing blows and slashing than it is for like stopping like an axe from chopping in or something like that. So it suits him for like rapier style stuff. It's lighter and quicker and more for deflection rather than just outright stopping things. So he's also works for the Moon Temple. So he's got that going on. So yeah, just black armor and white robes, very striking. Even overall, he's just very neat looking character. Very simple though, but even things like when a description includes things like a character like Geralt from The Witcher and that dude from Edward Kenway from Assassin's Creed 4. That's even as much a view into how the owner of this character views them. Things like that. Like it could just be as much of like an objective description of this type of armor. Literally just like just this. But there's also something that could be said about like how that person thinks of that character as a reference. So things like that example's attitude and posture and sort of the tone that they're hitting, even that sort of stuff can come in and influence the character. There wasn't so much of that here. I just didn't feel that it was necessary, but that can happen. I mean, people are just gonna do that. So if you're not, that'd be something I'd recommend for even if you're like strapped for ideas, not to just like take another character and just reskin them outright, but even just like it's just a good way to explain a character with their attitude and personality and sort of how they should end up feeling to the viewer, or to the originator, or the writer, or whoever you're dealing with. So yeah, thrown in the frame. It's become a habit of mine. I even do it at work now. It's very useful. Saves so much time for cleaning up the edge. I'm such a messy painter that I would just be needing to tidy up that edge constantly. I'd just be too meticulous. Photoshop crashing. It happens. So I didn't want to keep, I didn't want to make the color scheme too wild or anything. I really like the graphic like white and black look. So he's got black skin, white hair, white robes, and then the sigil with the black moon and the armor. Now, did I miss it here? Did he describe the armor as black, or did I just draw it black because I thought it looked good? Let me just double check here. I don't believe it mentions it, but it's a cool kind of. You don't often have like a monochromatic character. He does have a little bit of blue here with this like kind of gambeson cloth armor stuff, and also his the brown the brown what's it called? Ooh, the baldric that's holding that holds his sword, like that big sheath and belt. It should have some color so that it's obviously not like a black and white sort of thing, but it's a very striking look. His skin is technically purplish. Drow are usually depicted as either like black or even up to like a light purple. Sort of more like I think it's like night elves in certain things. They usually have it's either even lighter than like Barney the dinosaur. But I usually like drawing Drow with like very dark skin, very like this dark kind of blue, like a cool purple. I think it's just a neat look. I mean, but there is like you can do any sort of thing you want. You can even do like if they have interbred with other races, and that would lighten up the skin or change its like how like warm or cool the color is. But because this is the first Drow I've done, I think it would be good to just do it like as dark as possible. Is still you can still read like facial features. So even in the case of this, it's light enough really here just so that even just being able to tell or to render it out with the occlusion layer, so it's not too dark that it can't be made darker. Otherwise, you'll lose the form and even like I guess an alternative would be like if he had light hitting his face, and there was like oil or grease or sweat on his face, and then got to render that up as like shiny skin. But I didn't really want to draw him as shiny. And plus that's actually a really tough thing to do. Definitely would have to have reference for it. But getting that sort of sheen, it's very hard to make it look right. Otherwise it can just look really weird and blotchy and greasy, but not like in the way that you want it to. So I figured it'd just be just normal, sort of just dry skin. Just playing with the curves here. Curves are a neat thing. I'm going to do a video about those alone by themselves, but curves are a way to have it so that when you have a color go from more opaque to less opaque, like more transparent, or just basically whenever it transfers in its opacity, whether it's blending into another color or just disappearing into nothingness, the curves change the way that it does, the way that fade happens, and they can help colors or even tones like black go from like gray or like a blue into like a green or something. It just sort of makes the colors change as they blend in ways that you can't get with just a brush. It's very hard to explain unless I'm actually going over if I'm not actually just like doing it right in front of you with things. So I'll make a video about that, but it can help just making it look just a lot nicer. It's just a really good aesthetic, and it just gives it something that you just can't get otherwise. So in this case, with the rune, or the not runes, the clergy robes, I was just sort of going for a basic medieval kind of tunic type dress or type clothing bit, a piece of clothing, but I was going to do like a little kind of quarter cape just to have some dynamic motion and just something with a little bit more flair. The one thing I did was on the cape where it's attached there, it was just going to be these basic sort of triangles, and then here I'm just making it so it's a little bit more moon shaped. It's a little cheesy, I know, but just bringing in those little things, and then I end up putting in some little clips that are moon shaped as well, and just pushing that thematically. It's I think of the way that I work as being like naturalistic or like down to earth, where things don't usually get too flashy or bizarre. They're just really modest and practical. And that's one way to go about things, but it depends on what sort of world you're working for. But when you're doing stuff like that, it can be tough to find ways to add any sort of uniqueness or personality or context, because like you could just give somebody some priestly robes, and for all intents and purposes, they really probably would be pretty dull and uninteresting and boring looking. But you can't just let it sit like that. I mean, even for the fact that that's just lazy. But even like practical, dull things that are just sort of everyday things in real world, you go around and it's actually surprising how there's always those little things, like they sew it differently, or there's a different pattern, or there's different like materials used here and there. There's always like something that can give something a little bit of flair. And even if you just have like a sentence or a paragraph for a character, something like, just as cheesy as it is, just having like those collars, or that collar being based on the moon, it's something. It's those little things. A lot of stuff like that just isn't like anything worth note, but it's there, and it's a little detail, and when you can throw those in on a character, and there's a whole bunch, then it tells a story, it adds to the character, it fits in the world, and sometimes there's ones that are just super clever and stand up and blow everybody's mind. So any chance that you have, or any sort of clue or detail that you notice and stand out with, just go with it and just put it in there. A lot of the time, other people won't even think of it or notice the same things you do. I mean, there's a lot of crossover. People notice a lot of the same stuff. But there's any time that you just have like that impulsive thing over, like, you think to you it seems like a clue, just go with it. And just, if you're doing concept art, you're probably going to have to do a whole bunch of different designs too anyway, so you may as well try something. So for the splint armor, I was thinking of it as being just black and shiny metal. When it comes to the splint-like nature of it, I sort of thought it as being much more overlaid slat work, or like slating, lames. I know it's called lames usually. But just something much more sophisticated looking. I've got that mental notion in my mind of elves being sophisticated and skilled, and I don't know much about if Drow have that sort of like that reputation, but I figured just the elvenness of it couldn't hurt to include it. So something that just looks to me it looks like kind of like something that would be found in like the concept art for a Marvel movie, like by the time it's done, like something like that Odin would wear, but if it was painted black, like the Anthony Hopkins Odin. But something just really sophisticated, and it would be hard to manufacture and what have you. So I just went with that. Typically, it's you would see a lot of like fabric or mail or leather between the lames, like the splints. But in this case, I wanted them just overlapped all over the place. Just very sophisticated. And then just dark, shiny metal. I was reminded, there's a material in the Silmarillion that an elf lord, or like a king, has. It's called Galvorn, and it's described as like a black metal. It's pretty cool stuff, but it doesn't. There's not much detail about it, but it's a really light metal, kind of like mithril in a way, but black. And I was thinking that I just had that in my mind as I was working. I was picturing it being Galvorn armor. Yeah, these folds and structures of fabric over the belly. It's just there to try to use the fabric to emphasize the twist. Once you have somebody encased in armor and fabric, there's not very many cues you can give as to what sort of position their body's in. So anything you can use is gonna help with that. So those sorts of I guess you could call them like sort of like a tube shaped structure. You'll see that on like your own clothes or when you look at people, or it's sort of like those hills and valleys that are sort of being when you stretch fabric between 2 points and they get those lines that are going between those 2 points. That's basically like the rule for them. So that happens between 2 highest points with tension between them. So when you have like on the body under the cloth, you've got one lump over here and one lump over there, and there's like a valley between them on the body, and then whatever's over that valley become those wavy parts. I'll probably should do a video about that. But it can be helpful. So even just like when you're doing dynamic fabric like that's being like on a torso or an arm, you can start off by putting lines from the highest points to the highest points that have like a dip between them, and that'll help really outline the forms, and you'll have something to at least start on. If you don't have reference, that is. I mean, if you're just using reference, then just do that. Now I will admit that I love putting sabatons on people, these pointed toes. They're actually a lot more common. They look really weird today just because they're not common anymore, but there's a lot of sabatons, and there's a lot of ways to do them differently. But for this case, I thought it was pretty fitting. I mean, he's an elf, pointed toes. I know it's a stereotype, but it's one that I like. But it's also sort of suiting for his armor. This is one character that took a lot of rendering, as they all do apparently. So we'll just be seeing lots of rendering. Metals are a fascinating sort of material. They're challenging. They're very tough, without reference especially. They're not very forgiving. Like there's just so much light activity going on. When you have something like clay or fabric or wood, you can kind of just like shade it, render it out. You know, this part's going to have more light, this part's going to have less light. But when you get to metal, especially shiny metal, there's so much more that has to go on. It's like the color that is being bounced back out of it needs to change, the reflections and the refractions and all the different sort of bits of lighting, and you can fake a look really well. I was faking it here. I was sort of thinking it out, I was trying to think it based on how metal works, but there's this sort of thing where you can fake it, but the thing that makes me nervous about faking stuff is that people are gonna be people that know it better than me, and it's gonna stand out to them, and they're gonna look at it and say this person was faking it, because there's stuff that I can do with that, or there's a lot of stuff where I can tell when people fake certain things, and you want to try to be able to avoid doing that. You want as much knowledge as you can get, of course, but I think there's something to be said about even materials having a bit of an uncanny valley, where if you don't know what the uncanny valley is, it's basically the closest a depiction of a human gets to being real without quite getting to real, the more disturbing it looks. Where it looks close enough where it's like a cartoon is fine, you don't feel uneasy about a cartoon because it looks so distinct from a human, but the more and more realistic it gets and the more like weird little wrinkles and nuances, the human, a real actual human is so much more sophisticated than what a human can produce as an imitation real human, that our minds can still tell the difference, but the closer it gets without quite getting there, the more disturbing it looks. But I think that can happen to things like materials or anatomy or anything where it's not unsettling, but even though we can't reproduce something in our art, we can tell when something isn't how it should be. Like, you can't just draw something from your mind. I can't do that. I've known a lot of people that say like, oh, if I could draw, if I could just draw what was in my head, I'd make such amazing art. And I just say, I wish I could do that too. And you just can't do it. And it's like, if you think of a cartoon character from a show or a comic and then you try to draw it, you can picture them exactly in your head. Like if you're drawing like SpongeBob or Samurai Jack or whatever. I don't even know what cartoons are out there anymore. But if you try to draw them exactly how they're drawn in the show, you can picture them in your head perfectly. But the second you try to draw them, you realize that you don't actually know exactly how they draw. Like the example I always use is I know exactly what my mom looks like, but I could never draw her from my mind. Like I can picture her crystal clear, and all my memories of her are still there, but I can't just turn that into a drawing. And that is exactly the case with everything else. And what I'm trying to get at is with metals. Like, you can picture like a shiny car driving by in your mind. Like, it doesn't even have to be a metallic car. It's like one of those like normal, like just plastic, highly polished cars. Just picture that, and then now paint a car. Just go paint a car. And or even if someone said, okay, here's a drawing of a car, color it like a real car, and you can't do it. It's way too hard. There's too much nuance and understanding that you have to have before you can just do that from your imagination or from your mind. But you can tell when it's real. You can tell when it works or when it doesn't, and you can identify it. And it's weird, but yeah, you can't just make that direction. The way around it in the case of materials that I would say is research and understanding of the actual like physics of what's going on. So something like rendering, basically light and color in general. Once you start to understand how photons work and what's really happening with light, how light gets colored, how it scatters, what does surface roughness do to colors? Is something electric or dielectric? Is a material that's like metal or not metal? And all these different factors. And once you have those factors, you can just sort of plug them in and treat them as you go. Or even just like, it's like a rendering like unit in your mind where you're scattering light over a form, and based on what the form is doing, that depends on where the light's going to be hitting your eyeball from, and that's a lot to take in and a lot to explain, but that's sort of how it goes. So understanding the physics of light will get you a lot, and understanding like fabric will let you just draw fabric. I need more of that. I'm not very good at fabric, so I still got to study a lot of fabric if I'm ever going to use no reference, but we'll get there. And it's just a matter of breaking things down as just objects affected by physics and motion and material and light, and that's basically all there is to it. And you can study those things, and then you can just draw whatever you want when you understand those things adequately. You'll never get as perfect as when you're using reference, because real life is better than your brain, but you can get a lot done with just your imagination if you understand these things. So even with this fabric here, I'm doing a lot of faking and kind of hoping it looks real and or like real enough, just trying to make sure I'm getting it done on time. As long as it looks like fabric that was flowing in a certain direction, then I'm happy. So even with this outfit here, going with like the color scheme is very unobtrusive, but I even wanted the design to be unobtrusive, something clerical, orderly, and not flabbergasted. I mean, the description says that he's sworn to Moon Temple, and that sort of implies a sombrousness, or like a maturity and like a dutifulness, where there's not so much vanity and vulgarity, and this guy's got a job. He gets dressed. He puts on what he needs. He might take like a backpack every once in a while, depending on what his mission is. But his outfit would, by and large, be quite bare bones. He's a fighter that defends against evil, and that's what he's ready to do. So with Drow, painting their faces up here, I wanted to make sure that his hair also wasn't too dull or dead looking, so I do end up going in and making it kind of turquoise-ish slightly. With real human hair, there's only two pigments in it. There's black and there's red. And so people with black hair have a lot of black pigment. People with red hair have red pigment. People with brown hair have black and red pigment. And people with blonde hair have no pigment, or a very tiny amount of either one of them. So when you have even like really pale hair or really light hair, but you've got a certain amount of thickness of it, even like the shadows of it do take on the colors of like other sort of colors. They can be more warm or more like red or more black shadows as they get denser, but the effect is the same. So in this case, because he's got a skin color that isn't a human skin color, it's like a purple gray, like a cool purple. It's just not a human color at all. So I felt it makes sense with his hair to be a non-human color. So I wanted it to have like a blue sort of feel to it, a blue tint. Even rendering out his face, I was thinking as far as inspiration goes, the guy who played Loki, Tom Hiddleston, I think he's got a good Drow face. But as I was painting this guy, he started looking a lot like a combo between mostly Christian Bale and Shia LaBeouf. But I kept working on it and trying to make sure that I was changing it. I don't want it to look like an actual person. I mean, for Tom Hiddleston, it was really mostly like the nose and the type of eyelid that he has. But even then, once I sort of had an idea of what that was like, I just dropped it. I wasn't trying to make it look like Tom Hiddleston, but he just had that sort of character to his face. Finding faces more and more fun to do. For a long time, I was really intimidated by them. I would just sort of rush over them or not linger on them because there's just so much to get wrong. But when it comes to faces, if you want to get better at faces, start drawing skulls, but more importantly, start drawing the muscular system on skulls. It can be tough to find good reference pictures of facial muscles, but when you just start thinking about faces as like on their muscular level, the world just opens up to you as far as faces goes, like expressions and personalities and even just varying facial features. When you control it on that level, you'll have much more believable faces, much more perfected facial expressions and personalities, but you'll also have more control over the varieties you can put in it, and you'll avoid same faceism. So don't even worry about like skin for a while. Don't even worry about freckles and color or skin color or anything. Just think of just draw skulls and draw muscle systems. And then when you've drawn a whole bunch of those, draw some more faces, and you'll just have it. You'll just have it right there, and you'll be amazed at how much more informed you are. Like, you don't even need to worry about drawing people's real faces until you start talking about like wrinkles and things, but because wrinkles need research done too. We can't just fake wrinkles. Yeah, don't worry about drawing a bunch of people from magazines or TV shows or Google image search or even the street. Just draw muscle systems of the face. That's the secret to that. In this case, I was focused more on trying to make him look young, like young and healthy. Not too blocky, like not... even though like a lot of people who are young, like so he's 23. Like I've seen pictures of people that are 23 that like they look like I would have thought like 30 something. I remember there's one I've mentioned before. It was just a guy on my friend's. My friend had an issue of GQ magazine, and I thought he was like 30, but I found out he was 23, and he was just like a college football player or something. I guess he just had like a lot of testosterone, but his face looked blocky and chiseled, and I think that can do a lot to make somebody just look older and gruffer. So I guess in the case of this guy, I wanted to have the angles because that makes him look lean and fit and dedicated, but without being blocky. And I think it kind of worked out. So pointy nose, pointy cheekbones, pointy chin, but even letting like the gauntness of his cheeks linger or like stand out, and like the thick sort of muscle mass out in his cheek there at the corner of his mouth, and just letting them like even it does even look like his chin is maybe slightly weaker, like it kind of goes back in like he's got an overbite. But that's the kind of character that I liked on faces. Like sure, it's not like a magazine perfect sort of face, or like it doesn't look like an Andrew Loomis study, but that's totally fine. I'd rather have a character with personality than no personality or no uniqueness. See, on a high collar. Whenever I want somebody to look dignified, I give them a high collar. It just works. It's one of those old standbys. This is just the gambeson. The gambeson is the padded undergarment that goes, or the garment that goes under armor. It's just in this case, it's that blue coat, and it's not too thick or heavy or anything, but it is there. It's a nice way to give a little bit of color. So even in this case, I don't know if it was because I'm out of practice or because it's white hair, but I just found it incredibly difficult to draw it. It was like I had forgotten everything. I just kept needing to work it in and work around it, and it was a nightmare. It was scary. I was like, oh no, they're watching me do this. I'm recording, and I can't just pretend to forget to hit record. I wish I would have liked to have done. But yeah, it was strange. It could be a mix of both. I think it was that I was just out of practice. And that was scary. So I gotta keep doing more of these videos more often. It's just been hard because it's been summery now, and it's so nice. It's so nice out. It's good to have some times off every once in a while. Yeah, even as this hair gets thicker, like having sort of think like a polar bear. Like in a lot of pictures they look white, but really they're very yellow, and especially when their hair gets darker or denser and more grouped together, you can see how dark it can really get. It does block out a lot of light. I'd love to eventually do a drow that looks much more adapted to the darkness. Drows are always just elves painted purple, typically in art, but it'd be cool to have them be adapted to life underground. Like, I mean, the dark skin is fine. Things that live in caves aren't usually dark. It's magic. Who knows? But either like having their eyes shrink and their ears increase in size because they become more reliant on like echolocation, or their eyes get really big in order to take in the minimal amount of photons that might be down there from fires and things, or like glowworms that might be producing slightest light. Just make them look more like cave creatures. Still like elves. I don't know if you could make them still like beautiful or handsome anymore, but I think it'd be worth it. Or even just like their posture and their body type and how big they are. They'd probably have to be smaller because there'd be less food underground. And like what sort of things they were eating, if they're eating bugs or if they're eating fish or if they're eating algae or insects or whatever, or like raccoons or whatever gets lost down there, or bats. That's going to change their dentition, which is going to change the shape of their jaw, which is going to change the shape of their skull, which is going to... It's a big domino effect, but it'd be cool to play around with that. I would love to develop a fantasy world where all the races were more evolved and more adapted to whatever they were. Even like dwarves and elves, like, or Drow. If I even had Drow in there, then yeah, there's so much opportunity for that stuff. One thing I noticed too doing this is that I think I might have found that dark materials are more difficult to render than bright materials. Possible. But it shouldn't be. It's irrational if it is the case, but I'll keep working on it. It won't matter too much. So this is going to be one thing that's good for working on armor, or most things, including like shirts and whatever sort of stuff, is rendering out the general form and volume of it, and then going in afterwards and rendering details on top of that overall rendering, and then tweaking those little substructures if you need to. It can be a much more efficient way to get things done than rendering each little bit as its own thing. So general to specific, it always comes up. So in the case of this baldric, at least I think this would be classified as a baldric. Just something very utilitarian and simple, just very like non-flashy. You know, it's just what it's going to be. It's what it's got to do. It's based on stuff that actually exists, but it just makes sense to do that. It's practical. It's adjustable as well, so you can change the angle of it if you want. Leather is a fun material to paint and render. It's low gloss, so it's got like a pretty rough surface. I mean, it's not like, it is like a smooth surface, but it's not a shiny surface. It's easier to get it to look right because there's just less detail that it needs to have. Usually you just get the color right and then fray the edges a bit if you can. This is another thing in this case, and this thinking of it being as something that he was issued, I figured if it kept the astronomical or astrological theme, that would be a nice idea, just to help tie it in a bit more. So it does have like little star and moon shaped studs, just holding the big two sheets of leather together. But yeah, leather is fun. It's got wrinkles, it's got scars, it's got dark parts, light parts, different textures, and once you get it going, it's easy to sell once you have it there. Even this, just nice. I was even this threading part. So even just this, making it a little bit ornate, something like it's for a role, it's for an office. If this guy's going to be sworn to this and protects it, then they've probably got a long tradition of having guys that do that. So having something that looks a little bit more uniform, a little bit more slightly ornate, but not grandiose or vain. I think it worked out. And some rendering to tie it in and make it look like it. So even here on the gambeson, just simple padding, tubular padding. It would be pretty easy to install. You basically just put stuff in there and then just stitch it up and down in straight lines. And if you do it long and thin like that, then you can do it without needing to do any cross sections, so you can sort of kind of saves half the time. Although there's a lot of tubes there rather than the big. It's usually like a big square pattern. But I thought this way was a bit more. It's more elegant looking. So even in here, just putting in the slats, but trying to make it look like it can bend. So being cognizant of the joints. So the thing, like the space on the inside of the elbow, has a bunch of really thin segments, and there's space on the forearm ones, so they don't collide with that section. And then the armpits and everything, sort of following the flow and form of the body, and how it can move and blend and bend. So even in these shoulder joints, sort of overlapping these, just something that looks like it could be a bit more flexible. And then over the and unidirectional. Whenever there's a bend, it's got to be like perpendicular to the bend. So on the shoulder pad, on the pauldron, it's the pieces of metal have more than one direction on them, because they don't have to be bending or anything. They can just be whatever shape you want. So yeah, knee pads. Trying to give it segments so that it looks flexible. That was my main thing. I don't know if this would work. At this point, I'm afraid to find out. But it looks like it does. And at that point, I'm happy with it. But if it turns out that it didn't work, then I would have to change it. And I'm willing to do that. And then I figured just some simple black gloves. Gloves have a heroic look, I think. They're either heroic or villainous, and whichever one is wearing them, it makes it look more like that's the case. I don't know if I could explain that or if you believe me, but in my mind, I feel that I'm totally right. So I'm going to leave it there. In the case of the chest, it was mostly a part of sort of the overall scribble doodle that I did. But I don't remember what it's called, but I was looking at breastplates at work, and I was reading about the, what are they called? The tube bones, or these sort of bone breastplates that the Native Americans would wear as like a sign of wealth and might. They weren't practical. They weren't like good breastplates, but they were more of like a status symbol. And I've always found the look of them quite striking, and so I thought having something like that on this guy would be quite neat. It'd be like almost like if depending on what material it is, I'm picturing these as being like a mithril, like a really strong silvery metal. It could be something that just defends the heart or the internal organs from axes and slashes and things, but it's just, you needed something on the chest, something emblematic, but without overdoing the moon sort of look, so something just a bit more like a heroic shield sort of shape. I thought was fitting. And then in the case of this here, just with the use of the rapier, I thought I wanted to push my hand work. My hands need to get better. I need to get a lot better at making it so that it looks like people are actually holding things and that the hand is moving around better. Hands are another one of those things that's super easy to get pushed out of your brain. So in this case, I just wanted something that looked comfortable and relaxed with a sword in the hand. Like almost like playful and like confident. Even, I guess, slightly arrogant. I mean, rapiers always come with a lot of swagger. There's just so much like movement and like old world charm and what have you, that there's like a fluidity and a life to it that's not really found in like straight up well, I guess I don't know, a lot of sword fighting is very formal, or it's either really formal or really savage, but rapier's got a lot of style, and I thought having a daintier hand position would be suitable for that. And as far as the rapier goes, it's another largely sort of basic design. It's got the one main crossbeam. It was originally going to be straight, but then once again I thought, what about the moon? So it'll have a curve to it. And then these two sort of crossbars, they sort of reach out, and it's trying to use the singular bar to cover as much ground as possible. I could draw that sword from any angle, and it does sort of bow out quite widely and then comes down together at the bottom with the point. But yeah, it's something that could be reproducible. Like there could be like a musketeers group of these guys. It wouldn't be so ornate that it's like, if it looks too ornate, it looks like something that only the prince or the king would have, and that's no good. It's got to be something that this temple looks like they could afford to produce. And I think it does. Now, the description called for a sun-like flourish at the base of the rapier, and there's a lot of ways you can interpret such a simple description. So I went with this one. I think, there is a gold inlay, and I put that in the blade as like a decoration, like a filigree. But then for this section down here, I think most people, when they think of a golden sun flourish, they would think of the full circle. But at the base, when he's described as being the base of the rapier, I don't know if he meant the base of the blade or if he meant the pommel, like if he stamped it into, if he slammed his sword down like the butt of it, like the pommel at the end, if it would leave like a sun pattern, like if it's like that. But also I thought it'd be suitable, like if the base was just sort of the overall bottom. But then I could also use the sun as part of the handguard, and also a bit more points and savage bladery that could be used. So it's just sort of it's even just a cross section of a sun, almost like a pie, where it doesn't really extend much beyond those two handguard rails going up around the front. But it's there. It's a way to include it from the description, and it's there. But it's not exactly what people might have expected. Then on the shield, I wanted to gussy it up with some chip marks and maybe some scorch marks from it could be mud, it could be some fire magic staining, some smoke damage, or who knows, and some age to it. It's been around a while, well used. Things like armor, especially if you don't have reference, you can render it and render it and render it and render it, and there's no stopping you. You could just keep rendering and rendering forever. But in this case, I wanted to just give it just a little bit more of detail on the edge. It gives it a little bit more depth, and it also, depending on who's looking at it, it can imply a little bit of a flick to the edge, like a little bit more of like a flourish. There's a little bit something more catching the light. Putting some wrinkles on that part of the baldric, just because that would be the flexion point, and so the wrinkles would follow where the sword would roll up and flap at that angle. I think faces are also another one of those things. Like if you're not using reference, like I wasn't really using reference for this for the face. Like you can. Everything kind of looks right until you take a step back for a little bit and look at it again, and then it's all flat and weird looking and dumb. And then you can just keep working it and working it. I didn't want to make them too similar to Geralt from The Witcher, so I made it more of like an undercut. Also white, of course, white eyelashes, and then white facial hair too. I figure if their hair's going to be white, it's probably all of their hair, or at least it should be. So I figured I'd paint it in, and then just because my opinion is clean shaven faces are reserved for the rich and the vain. I think male characters should typically have at least some hint of some scruff. They're out in the wild, it's hard to shave, no one really cares in that sort of setting. Unless you can afford clean-shaven face. So just a little bit. There's also to make them look young. Especially with such a northern European-looking face. They don't often have the fullest beards, so I think having some limited coverage of facial hair is important for that sort of stuff. But anyway, this was Remington Loonsoul for Gianni, and he was a blast to do. I hope to do more Drow characters. This is for the free weekly character art lottery, held every Sunday night and Monday on Twitter, and I'll let you know what to tweet before Tuesday. You just tweet that hashtag, and you'll be automatically entered to have me design and draw your original fantasy role-playing tabletop pen and paper characters free of charge. So yeah, this was a blast to do. I'd love to do more Drow. And anyway, thanks for watching, everybody. Hope it helped.